Hi, everyone. So glad you're here. Today is part 2 of our Venezuela miniseries. And today we're going to look at what the administration is saying versus what the actual evidence is suggesting. And let's just start with the obvious. The justifications of what the administration has done and is doing right now, they keep changing. So let's compare them to the actual data and see where that leads us. And as always, I will walk through this, give you a framework for fact checking, walk through some examples, and largely leave the conclusions up to you. I think we have too many people out there as creators, as media influencers, that are trying to do all the thinking for you. And this channel is really about empowering you to think for yourself. That's how I think we make a better future that we can all benefit from. So let's dive into it. When governments use force abroad, they always give reasons. Sometimes those reasons shift for sometimes very understandable reasons. If something happens to us, the first reports can often be confusing, but yet leaders want to give ideas of assurances out to the general public. And so what they may say at first may not be true later. But that isn't what we're talking about right now. This operation that the United States did in Venezuela was planned out. How do I know it was planned? Well, it went well. I've been part of military operations. The ones that don't go well have pretty terrible planning. The ones that go off without a hitch from an American perspective were ultimately planned incredibly well. So today we're going to compare the public justifications to publicly available data. I'm not going to throw up every piece of data. I'll just tell you where to go find it for yourself. And really the main point I want you to walk away from this video is a better understanding of how to fact check these things for yourself that you can take as a skill to use with everything else you hear. Not just from this administration, but from any government anywhere in the world. So first, let's talk about what our United States President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense has said as justifications. We can go find a whole bunch of individual quotes, but generally we've heard justifications that had to do with drugs, i.e. being cartel, being narco-terrorists, adding Maduro and his administration to the narco-terrorist lists, or just adding them to a terror list because of drugs. We've heard this multiple times. You can find primary sources of what the president, vice president, secretary of state, secretary of defense have said about drugs. We've heard security threats about how the administration or the regime in Venezuela was really trying to hurt Americans. We heard about criminal networks, whether it's through immigration, through drugs. We've definitely, when you hear cartel, think criminal network. We heard the humanitarian concern angle, which, to be fair, Venezuela is an incredibly unstable country. There is an entire history there that, if you would like, I'm happy to dive into. There is genuinely a humanitarian concern to be had. We'll get more into that here in a minute. The election of President Maduro was fraudulent. It is widely accepted in international circles that it was fraudulent, and that the opposition leader who really, we believe, won that election, that is pretty widely held view. We'll dive more into that claim here in a second. Then there's they stole oil from us. I'm not making that up. Go Google it. Read the exact quotes for yourself. But let's start going through this. The first one. Let's start with the claim. Not summaries, not headlines. And claim 1, this was about drugs. Well, our department, or DEA, Drugs Enforcement Agency, and ONDCP have data that is publicly available. You can go Google it. What that data consistently shows is that Mexico is the primary source or transit country for fentanyl, meth, and much of the cocaine that enters the United States. Colombia is the major cocaine producer. Asia is the major source for the precursor chemicals that go into making things like fentanyl. Venezuela is not listed as a major source country for in these reports. It's just not there as a major source country. If this was about drugs, we would be targeting supply chains in Mexico. We'd be targeting supply chains in Colombia. We'd be targeting supply chains in Asia. That's where the narrative does not meet with the evidence, and the context is misleading, which leads you to a very different conclusion. That's the framework we're using, by the way. Framework for fact checking, the most simple framework I can give you is identify their claim, identify primary evidence, in this case, government reports about where drugs are actually coming from, fill in any missing context if you need it, and then make your conclusion so your conclusion can be based on evidence, not on your politics. The second point, for any of the drug claims, really go to the DEA National Drug Threat Assessment. It's called the NDTA. It has maps, it has charts, it has source country breakdowns, and you'll see the source data, the primary data that our federal government workers do year in and year out to identify where these drugs are coming from. We know it. It is publicly available. You can look at the DEA map of fentanyl. You can look at the UNODC cocaine flow map. I'll put a couple of those up here so you can see it very quickly. We'll also put the links down in the description. Now let's move on to another claim. This was about security threats versus, the public threat that we have to go do something about is the narrative. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence does an annual threat assessment, and it lists China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and transnational criminal organizations, mostly Mexico-based, as the biggest threats. Venezuela is not listed as a direct military threat to the United States. So if you're going to look at security claims, go to the ODNI annual threat assessment. It's public, it's nonpartisan, and it's written by career analysts. That will fill you in on the context. You can treat that as evidence because everything that's written in there is sourced from intelligence evidence that could be made public. That's how you should make a better conclusion. We'll put the link to the ODNI threat list down below. Claim 3. This was about criminal networks. Okay, if the justification is that this is all about criminal networks, then you have to wrestle with the fact that this administration, particularly President Trump himself, pardoned the former president of Honduras who had directly helped transport more cocaine into his country than Maduro ever could dream of. It does not prove motives. It just shows the inconsistency how criminal networks and drug-related actors are treated differently by this administration. I'm not going to tell you why that is. I don't for sure know based on evidence and context that I can feel really good about why, but I think that leads you to a very different conclusion knowing that he pardon a drug trafficker who is part of a criminal network at a much higher scale than Maduro, and then launch a military incursion into Venezuela to go get Maduro. That's where evidence can really change your conclusion more than politics can. Next claim, this is about humanitarian concerns. Let's look at United Nations data. Venezuela humanitarian crisis or human rights crisis is very real, but it's also been ongoing for years. And the United States does not consistently use force in humanitarian crises. If we did, we'd be in Haiti. If we did, we'd be sending massive amount of troops every time there's an earthquake somewhere. There are humanitarian crises happening for years and years and years all over the world that we don't do anything about. That's where I find it hard, and that extra context and the extra evidence of what we haven't done, I think leads you to a very different conclusion than what this administration talks about. For humanitarian claims, I would suggest you go to the United Nations OCHA or the UNHCR. Again, put the links up on the screen. These organizations track crises globally, and they have some excellent graphics. We'll throw a couple up here on the screen. The UNOCHA shows that Venezuela humanitarian needs and provides an overview. It includes charts about food insecurity, displacements, and health access. The UNHCR really shows a situation report about Venezuela, about refugees and where they're going to. And if you look at those maps, you can see it's mostly impacting Northern South America. It's not necessarily hugely impacting us here in the United States. And if they do, it is largely going through Mexico. Next claim. And this was about fraudulent election. All right. If this is the justification the administration wants to go with, then the logical next question is, which candidate does the United States recognize as a legitimate winner? And what we've seen so far from President Trump and Secretary Rubio is that they're recognizing the same exact regime that they just tried to topple, which is incredibly confusing, not just for us here in America, but for those in Venezuela and for those international actors who are trying to wonder, how big of a deal is this? For election claims, you can really look at international observer reports. There's a lot of them out there. You could look at domestic electoral commission statements. You could look at independent monitoring groups. Mostly for this one, I would suggest look at who the United States government recognizes as the winner after we've did the military action. If it's the same people, then it really wasn't about the fraudulent election in the first place. That's how you get from claim to evidence and context to a conclusion that matters. Finally, they stole oil from us. Well, Venezuela oil is owned by the PDVSA. It's a state-owned oil company. The United States does not own Venezuelan oil fields. U.S. companies, including Chevron right now for the last couple of years, are trying to operate in Venezuela. And in the past, in the 70s and before, U.S. companies had contracts to operate in oil fields. Those contracts never meant ownership of those fields. There's no legal framework under which Venezuela could have stolen oil from the United States. For claims like this, we can go check who legally owns a resource, whether the United States had contracts or concessions, which they were concessions, whether sanctions or disputes exist, whether any U.S. entity actually had property rights that could have been stolen. That's the part that really matters. And finally, I just want to point to why the fact that these justifications, whether you believe one or two or three or none of them, but why the fact that they're shifting in itself actually matters, and how you can fact check anything. You see, democracies rely on transparency. We rely on consistent reasoning, and we rely on public oversight, not just of Congress providing oversight to the administration, but the American people and the way we vote providing oversight for the people that we elect. We want them to think through this stuff. We want them to have good rationales for why they do what they do. And when you see the justifications shift all the time, and it really starts to feel like they're just trying to see what might stick, it feels, and here's where I'll go back to a vibe for a second, it feels like they haven't really thought it through. And I think we've shown in this video that you can fact check almost anything by really identifying the exact claim, getting out of the vibe cycle that's on social media. Go to primary sources, government, international organizations, other actual documents. Compare the claim versus the data. Add the additional context. You might need some history. You might need some other context that might be missing. Sometimes building a timeline of how much this stuff shifts can help build that context. Then finally, look for the alignment between the context, the evidence, and what the actual claim was. That's how you have a conclusion that you can feel comfortable about, and one that is based on evidence, not just politics. I hope you learned something from this. I hope you share it. I hope that you practice this. If you have questions about what you're seeing, feel free to reach out. Happy to engage with this audience as we're building a movement that can build a better version than the politics that we've had, that can point and hold politicians accountable when they do start shifting their actual reasoning for things that they should have known beforehand. We can build a better future by working together. Thank you. If you haven't yet, please click like on this video, drop a comment below, and click that subscribe button. It'll help the YouTube algorithm make sure that these videos are getting into your feed. Thank you.